and welcome back to this week's episode of Digital Law News, produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK. I'm joined by my colleagues Peter Wright and Heather Anson, and we're just going to run through some news stories which will be coming up this week. I'll pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, my name's Peter. I'm a solicitor and the Managing Director at Digital Law, and looking forward to running through some of this week's stories, and in particular being able to welcome Heather as well, given that we are looking in our first story at issues around cryptocurrency.
Hi, is that me now? Okay. I'm Heather Anson, Managing Director at Anson Evaluate, and today I am all things crypto. It's literally my day is dedicated to that, so a perfect day to have me on talking about this.
Thanks, Heather.
Yep.
So our first story is the Treasury has announced that it regulates some cryptocurrencies as part of a wider plan to make the UK a hub for digital payment companies. The so-called stablecoins will become recognised forms of payment to give people confidence in using digital currencies. And so stablecoins are designed to have a stable value linked to traditional currencies or assets like gold. I'll pass over to Heather to kind of explain this further.
Hi, yes. Well, again, this is a promise to do something that they want to do, to try and do something they're not really sure they can do, but let's have a go. The main point about it, there are a couple of aspects to it, but the main point we're going to talk about is the idea of stablecoin, and that concept. I mean, people are still trying to get their heads around cryptocurrency in general, so the idea of stablecoin can be a little bit confusing, but the idea, if we relate cryptocurrency and real world currency, as I call it, real world currency, or stuff that's backed by a government, that's what we call in the financial world fiat. Fiat is something that's backed by a government via coin. Then what they're trying to do is create a stability in a cryptocurrency by creating a cryptocurrency that is essentially a fiat, or something that is backed by the UK government and has some sort of ability to be tracked against something. I think how I see this is sort of an attempt to try and do a 21st century Bretton Woods agreement. And again, I'm getting kind of wonky on the financial stuff, but the Bretton Woods agreement was essentially post World War II, when all of the big nations got together and said, we need to do something about the way we're trading and stabilize our monetary system for global trading. We need to have some sort of uniform system for doing this. And so they had a big conference in Bretton Woods, and the outcome, due to some, I believe, some very clever networking and sleight of hand by the US delegate, the US dollar became and still remains the currency for international transactions. I do international transaction documents all the time, and you'll see that they are still all US dollar is the one the references, and that's what came out of Bretton Woods. And back then, it was one of the reasons why it was between the US dollar and the British pound sterling, oddly enough, and you guys lost out to us. One of the reasons the British Empire didn't continue, they didn't end up being the universal coin around the world. But the US dollar was backed by gold. You know, it was called the gold standard because it was backed by gold. So every dollar had actual gold, could be exchanged pound to pound for essentially for gold. And it had that stable value. That lasted for less than 40 years, but the lasting impact of the Bretton Woods Agreement is that we have more trust in certain currency. We have trust in having international transactions because we all came together and agreed, and we ended up with the IMF and what is now the World Bank because of Bretton Woods. So the idea is the UK, they missed out on the first Bretton Woods. So if we can do it, they can do a second run at Bretton Woods and end up with something that the UK is backing, that's either backed by a commodity such as gold or just the UK government backs it, like it does monies in the bank, you know, having up to a certain amount secured in a bank in British pounds, that's backed, then they'll have a chance to be one of the world's centers for commerce in the digital world. That's, I think, part of the hope. Not that I'm probably reading too much into that in the Bretton Woods relationship, but in essence, that's what a stablecoin would do. You'd be able to then shop with it from a local level. This is what it would do for us. We'd be able to go to stores and or buy online with the currency. You'd be able to pay employees in that if you wanted to, because it would be considered, it could be actually valued against the pound sterling, so you could ensure that your employees were getting paid at least a minimum wage. Any other questions?
I mean,
I was just going to say, sorry, the sleight of hand there with regards to the dollar becoming the reserve currency under Bretton Woods. I mean, sleight of hand or just full-on fraud. I mean, the guy went and took the documents that had been agreed with all the other delegates, including John Maynard Keynes, and then just wrote in dollar without anyone else's agreement, as though that's what had been agreed on the plane on the way home. So
no, what he did was say, can we just use he was right. He says, I'll just write this down. He says, I'm just going to use the US dollar as a placeholder here. Is that okay? We need to reference a coin, so let me just, I'll just put USD as a placeholder. And when it came to the end, people were just like, well, we'll have to change all these documents if we don't use the US dollar. And the delegate from the UK was kind of poorly, so spent most of his time in his room, and not down basically hustling on the floor going, yeah. So
poorly, he was terminally ill, I think, at the time as well.
He was. So probably shouldn't have been the one sent by the UK government to try and the case. Anyway.
But the point, as you say, is that Bretton Woods established all of the institutions and financial rules that have underpinned world trade for the subsequent 70 years. Yeah, I suppose the question I'd like to ask is, do you think, though, that in terms of the UK Treasury trying to do this, is this something that really, if they wanted to be at the cutting edge, is this something they really should have been doing about 5 years ago? It seems a little bit too late to the party, really, to now be talking about this.
Well, yes and no. I mean, there are probably two prime examples of stablecoins right now are Tether, which is a Chinese stablecoin, and Binance USD or BUSD, which is indexed against the US dollar. So it's not encouraged by the US government, but basically Binance has said that its value is tethered to the US dollar. So whatever the value of the US dollar is, that's what the value of Binance USD is. So it itself created a stable coin. There have been, I know that Meta has talked about creating one that would essentially be a stable coin. I think it's a nice idea, but yeah, I think if they were really going to do this, they would have had to have the regulatory structure in place, and they do seem to just be starting and stopping on regulation. To their in their defense, this is a very complicated area if you don't understand it at all, which if you're writing government regulations and laws, you probably don't know a whole lot about cryptocurrency and how it's traded and what it is. And the crypto world intentionally kind of makes it a little bit more complicated than is entirely necessary, probably for that purpose. So they're on the back foot just by the very idea that no one really understands this, as opposed to regular currency, which is a little more understandable. So do I think it's really going to work in the long run? At this stage, I don't see that happening, but I won't say absolutely not, because at least I know there's a history of them trying to be the first, even if they got beat to the poll by a US dollar.
It's funny that you mentioned the whole regulation and the fact that UK's regulating is somewhat off and on, because I was reading a story from, I think it was the Financial Times, and it was comparing how the fact that arguably Abu Dhabi is now kind of the hub for all things digital, and I believe Bitcoin will be opening up one of their biggest kind of headquarters there in the coming months. And so at the moment, I think there are definitely some other world leaders that are certainly ahead of the UK in relation to cryptocurrency.
Well, yeah, the UAE is actually trying to get ahead of the oil bubble by digging into crypto and creating that environment. So it's much more likely that they will have, based on what I've been seeing out of the UAE, it does appear that they're more likely to have proper regulations and some form of recognized stablecoin. Whether the rest of the world's going to want to rely on the stablecoin from the UAE, I don't know, but I think it was a smart move for them to get ahead of the, oil as a primary income source. They're shifting to, they want to be the center of the universe for crypto assets, and so far they're doing a good job of that.
Interesting as well that this announcement, when it's come through, was part of sort of several things from Rishi Sunak within the course of the last week. And while it is such a significant move, I think it's sort of got a little bit lost under the general noise of the cost of living crisis in the UK and the issues around inflation, oil, energy, etc., and the tax rises kicking in, and a number of sort of negative headlines suggesting, oh great, Rishi Sunak announces this, because that's really what the country needs right now, is a stable coin, rather than deciding to reduce the effect of the tax rises that have kicked in, which sort of meant that what could have been a potentially positive news story ended up, I think, being skewed as a bit of a negative story as a result, and perhaps people not seeing that this is an attempt at innovation, albeit perhaps a little bit later than it would have been ideal to really make a difference.
And falling on deaf ears, considering, I think one of the stark comparisons this morning is that you've got people going to food banks and turning away potatoes because they don't have the money to pay for the fuel to cook the potatoes. So when you've got that in comparison to, shall we create a stablecoin environment, it even though it may be a really good idea for the long-term health of the economy, it does fall on deaf ears when it's not understandable in that context.
Yes.
And doesn't feel like it should be a priority. Okay, I think that's all for me today, and I will leave you guys the rest of your topics. Thanks for asking me on.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks for joining us today, and hopefully we'll get you back soon to talk about some other crypto stories that will no doubt appear in the coming months.
Great, thank you. Bye-bye.
Moving on to then our next story, and somewhat away from cryptocurrency. Two teenagers from the UK have appeared in court charged with hacking of a major cybercrime gang. So these two boys have been released on bail, subject to certain conditions. They have been arrested as part of an international police investigation into the Lapsus gang, which has hacked major tech firms including Microsoft and Nvidia. Both teenagers are charged with 3 counts of unauthorized access with internet to impair operations of or hinder access to a computer, and 2 counts of fraud by false representation. See, this is quite an interesting story because very often here that there are no arrests made in relation to hacks, and so for the first time here, we're kind of seeing 2 teenagers brought to justice in a sense. So I'll pass over to Peter to continue.
Yeah, that's right, Amelia. I think it's really significant that we're actually seeing, for once, an example of hackers who are being brought to justice after an investigation. I think too often we are talking in these discussions each week about hackers, even down to, for example, on Netflix and the documentary there about romance fraud, and the fact that he has never faced proper censure or any proper punishment for the vast level of fraud that's been carried out. Yet, because he's deliberately gone from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, under-resourced criminal authorities are very often, judicial authorities just do not have the resources and ability to investigate these complex frauds. In this instance, there has been a large-scale investigation. It has identified that these two teenagers were involved in the hacking, and also it's the fact that, you know, in the small print here, this matter's been referred to the Crown Court. Now, if we were looking at a fairly straightforward conviction and a straightforward potential sanction in terms of any potential penalties, it would have stayed in the Magistrates' Court. But in this instance, they've said, no, let's send it to the Crown Court. So A, that would mean potentially there would be a jury trial, but it also means that there are far more penalties, including custodial penalties, that can be imposed by the court. So despite the fact that the identities of the two teenagers hasn't been revealed because of their age, they could be facing quite significant, potentially, I think, custodial sentences and other penalties as a result of any convictions they might receive here. And it's a significant marker showing the fact that you can't carry out these sorts of hacks and frauds without facing quite serious penalty if you are caught.
However, at like the same time, we've obviously got this story where these two people have been arrested. The following morning, the Lapsus has actually been posting again, releasing stolen material from a software development company from some headquarters in Argentina. And so this is kind of a great example of where you see that despite the fact we have had these two people arrested, that cybercrime is actually a real growing threat. And no matter, it's kind of like a hydra head, you know, the more you cut off, the more that grows back in its place here. Because it's, when it comes to cybercrime, a lot of the time it's not just one person operating. You do get these gangs of people that operate, and like I said, you cut off one head, it's quite easily replaced with someone else. So it'll be interesting to see whether we get any kind of other takedowns, because it is very difficult to have a lasting impact in relation to cybercrime.
That's quite right. We're looking here, of course, at collectives, so groups of people, and indeed it is unfortunately like Hydra from Marvel Comics in that respect. But let's hope that this means that there can be an ongoing investigation that might eventually impair the ability of Lapsus to keep on releasing stolen material like they have done there on the dark web with impunity. Hopefully that can be curtailed in due course.
Thanks, Peter. So kind of keeping with the theme of cyber attacks, the Works has been forced to shut shops temporarily and suspend new stock deliveries after a cyber attack. The retailer has said that 5 out of its 526 shops have been closed since last week after hackers gained access to its computer systems and caused issues with its tills. Customers are experiencing longer delivery times for online orders as a result, and the company said that no shopper's payment details have been compromised. However, despite this, I did read at the end of the story that it has been reported to the ICO. So we've got a lot to unpick here. I'll pass over to Peter.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, I found it fascinating just seeing that, because you tend not to think that the Works is such a big chain, but yeah, 526 stores in most town and city centres around the country. This is one of the few retailers that actually manages to still get people through the door by offering massive discounts for the hard copy books that it sells, very often bigger discounts than you could get if you were shopping online. Yet in this instance, it looks like they've been on the receiving end of a ransomware attack. It looks like they can't confirm exactly what information has been compromised. It looks like because of course, under GDPR, you've got that requirement to report a data protection breach within 72 hours of date of knowledge. So they've taken the view of, if in doubt, let's report it, which is very sensible on their part, rather than trying to fudge it or wait until they have confirmed definitely that personal data may have been involved. And it also looks like they're trying to suggest that, oh, this hasn't affected our payment systems because they use a third-party payment processing provider. So it looks like it's the Works systems that have been compromised, not their customers. So for all they know, It could be, for example, information relating to staff and payroll and internal things that's been compromised, but actually customer data in this instance, i.e. people's sort codes, account numbers, all those payment processing information, that should not have been compromised, appears to be their preliminary view. But as is often the case with these things, it will only take a full investigation by forensic IT specialists to actually work out what information has been compromised. And who knows, if a hacker was in there with full command and control of the system, it could be that they were somehow able to gain access to that third-party payment provider. So that's what they will be seeking to establish in the coming days and weeks.
It'll be interesting to see whether we hear any more about this particular story, especially as you say, this is relatively kind of new, and a lot of these investigations take a few more weeks to bring out the real nitty-gritty of what has actually happened. Moving on to our next story. This is about the Digital Markets Unit, which was launched last year. This was launched to oversee the regulation of large platforms such as Google and Facebook as part of a bid to help protect other actors, including new publishers, from unfair practices. However, Boris Johnson has delayed these plans because these were supposed to give UK digital regulators the power to tackle the dominance of technology firms. And so this is fairly interesting here. There's a lot to unpack, especially given the fact that I think a few weeks ago we mentioned the fact that Facebook and Google may have to pay media outlets and newspapers for presenting their articles and their news. So it's an interesting timing here.
Indeed, and I think as well on timing, the behind this story is actually a bit of a lost opportunity. So at the same time as these articles have been in the Times newspaper about the Digital Markets Unit, across the channel in Europe, they've been agreeing the mechanisms behind the new Digital Markets Act, which will regulate the large platforms, so-called gatekeepers, in terms of their actions, in terms of, for example, where they usually try and buy up their competitors, and as they've done in the past. The idea of the Digital Markets Unit, when this was announced last year, was you thought, oh, great, because it usually takes a very long time for draft EU legislation to make its way onto the statute book. I think there was a feeling that the UK could be speedier and more nimble here and introduce light touch regulation that would be proportionate and effective in governing the activities of the large tech platforms without having some of the more onerous requirements that are contained in the Digital Markets Act, which is seen as being a more sort of statist, dirigist way of regulating the sector as a whole. However, unfortunately, since that initial announcement last year, we've now had agreement between the European Parliament and the European Commission on the passage of the Digital Markets Act, and indeed the Digital Services Act package as well seems to be moving forward, and that will be becoming law now sooner rather than later because of the level of political will to actually do something about this within Europe. So it's not going to take years and years and years like other things have done, like the draft e-privacy regulation, for example, let alone GDPR, which took 4 years of horse trading to get anywhere from being presented in draft format in 2012 and becoming law in 2016, becoming law in 2016, and then enforcement being commenced in 2018. So, you know, a long time to get anywhere. In this instance, now it's the UK delaying the sort of further detailed work around the Digital Markets Unit, which is an offshoot of the UK Competition and Markets Authority, and instead now it's the EU pressing ahead with the Digital Markets Act. So it's a pity that a little bit of you know, intention and will has been lost here by this, instead sort of booting it into the long grass. I appreciate the government's got a lot of different things to look at the moment, pandemic, energy issues, etc. But this was a major opportunity to, I think, set the tone for how the UK wanted to regulate this sector post-Brexit. And instead, that initiative has now been frittered away, sadly. So it's a pity that this is not seen in government as being a priority. I think it's incredibly important for the future of the digital economy in the UK. And I'm very disappointed to see that the government doesn't seem to think it's important in the same way. You know, it's the way that this sector is governed and regulated that could continue to make the UK a more appealing place for these sorts of companies to have infrastructure to to make investment. But as I say, that initiative appears to be being lost, sadly.
I think it's prominent to mention here the cyber strategy that was released at the beginning of this year, which would also kind of highlight the need for this regulation to be brought in sooner rather than later, as we were kind of looking forward in this strategy to kind of see the government put into action kind of units and task forces such as this.
Indeed, but there's even a story there in it of itself, because that strategy itself was delayed for a number of months before it actually was finally published. So again, it's almost testament to that slight lack of urgency around these things. I mean, this stuff I would have thought should have urgent written all over it, given that digital is increasingly a more important part of the economy in terms of e-commerce as a whole. We talked about the works earlier on and traditional sort of retail, and that is the declining market. It is stuff online that is the future of commerce. Like it or not, that's the way it's gone over the last few decades. So having clear rules of the playground in this regard, I would have thought was crucial.
Speaking of kind of rules in the playground, our next story looks at TikTok. I think most of our listeners will be aware of TikTok, and this particular case is looking at the misuse of children's data. So this particular case has gone to court, and the child commissioner, I believe it is representing the particular plaintiff in this case. And at the moment, they have only released the fact that this child is 12 years old and comes from London. And while on the surface you wouldn't think there is actually much to talk about, whereas actually here, the fact that they have released these details in itself is quite prominent. I'll pass over to Peter to kind of explore the fact that releasing children's data like this is a slight change.
It is. I mean, social media companies classically take a, you know, there's some horrific things that happen on the platforms that the social media companies condone in terms of things like grooming, terrible images of abuse, material that encourages self-harm and suicide. That stuff seems to happen on there every day, and the platforms really couldn't seem to really care less, is the really terrible thing. Usually they will then, surprise, surprise, hide behind data protection law as a reason not to engage when, for example, there have been issues around one child or minor that ended up committing suicide and referenced in a note an individual they had met online on social media. And then when the parents have tried to gain access to the social media accounts to find out who this individual might be, who played a role in the death of their child, sure enough, oh no, we can't do that because of data protection. What a surprise. In this instance, the court has been involved in trying to extract information in relation to minors, in relation to account users on TikTok. And it looks like in this instance, the court is insisting that information should indeed be disclosed. I hope that this judgment is at least an indication that by looking at the text of it, that the social media platforms might decide that they should take a slightly different view to the sort of three-line whip approach that they take when it comes to the data protection of their members, because there comes a point where I think they are starting to harm themselves, to harm families and harm others, where there's this terrible conduct that's on there that is having real world consequences in terms of its users, and then very often it is, you know, users themselves, vulnerable users, their families, who then have problems trying to get to the root of the real world problems that some of the abuse and harmful material on social media has created. Let's hope that they may start to be a little bit more pragmatic with regards to how they choose to apply their rules, because believe me, when they're saying, oh, it's data protection, it really isn't. They're taking a deliberately obtuse interpretation of data protection legislation, be it GDPR or the Data Protection Act, because it's convenient for them.
Thanks, Peter. And we actually were part of a conference this week, and it went into quite a lot of detail in relation to this story and made quite a good comparison between, I believe it was Lloyd v. Google, the case. And it'll be interesting to see, they were waiting on the result of Lloyd v. Google before actually approaching this case. It'll be interesting to see how kind kind of what the result is, because they are yet to reach a result, and it'll be waiting on the coming months to see what actually comes of this and what sort of precedent it sets. Is this, when we're looking at a case dealing with minors and with such a big tech giant, this hasn't really happened before, because as you all know, social media is a relatively new thing. And before TikTok, I mean, the likes of Facebook was targeted at sort of a slightly higher audience, and TikTok being, well, as it is, I don't think there's many children that are not on TikTok. And like Pete's mentioned, there is that difference in content. It'll be interesting to see what precedent this sets. Moving on to our next story. This is actually kind of relative to what Peter said earlier when we were looking at the cyber gang. This is how German police dismantled a Russian darknet site. This site actually coincidentally was called Hydra, and the website was a base station of cyber crime, surviving for more than 6 years, selling drugs and illegal goods. However, after a tip-off, German police seized the site's servers and confiscated about 23 million euros in Bitcoin. Police say that 17 million customers and more than 19,000 seller accounts were registered on the marketplace, which now carries a police seizure notice. So Hydra specialised in same-day dead drop services, where vendors would hide packages in public places and then there would be a pickup location. And so over the past 6 months, high-profile darknet markets have been shut down, but Hydra seems to kind of stay impervious to the stops. This story is particularly interesting, actually, if you read to the bottom, because the BBC research earlier this year revealed that the most common way for darknet sites to close is via so-called exit scams, where administrators voluntarily shut down the sites but steal their customers' funds in the process. This story actually has a lot to unpack, starting with, obviously, this is a darknet site and they have seized Bitcoin, and this seems to be a massive catch for German police, but also kind of the double extortion that's been continued here, because you've got these criminals and even kind of there's no, no honor among thieves. That's kind of the story behind this. So I'll pass over to Peter.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, just reading this story as well, I couldn't help but be reminded of used to be a comedy sketch show in the UK called Mitchell and Webb, and one of their skit routines was where there were a couple of officers in the SS talking during World War II, and then they end up looking at each other and going, hang on, our uniforms are black and we have these skull and crossbones on the lapels, and we're not the bad guys, are we? We're not actually the bad guys. This sort of terrible moment of realization that you might not be actually on the side of good. And reading about this, you know, you're operating a website called Hydra on the dark web that involves selling arms and drugs, and you think, if you're running that, you know, you really must know. You know, there must be a moment there where they sort of think, well, yeah, we definitely are the bad guys here, clearly. And thankfully, for once, it looks like they have faced enforcement. And this investigation shows that numerous other markets on the dark web have been taken down, but Hydra appeared to remain impervious to attempts by law enforcement authorities over the years to actually be able to do anything about it and take it down. It looks like it was written in Russian. Sellers and vendors were in Russia, the UK, and Belarus and Kazakhstan. Obviously, servers internationally as well seem to have bulletproof hosting that in Germany that meant it couldn't be taken down. But eventually, it looks like it has now been seized, and the platform and criminal content is no longer available. So at least that is now just one small victory in the sort of ongoing war of stopping this stuff being so freely available on the dark web. I did see at an exhibition a couple of months ago, a conference. They actually did a live hack where they went onto the dark web and showed within seconds, you know, this is where you could buy yourself a pistol, this is where you could buy some drugs, etc. You know, so all content that's illegal. I mean, let's face it, handguns are illegal in the UK. You know, so the idea is that following a mass shooting in a school in the mid-1990s, handguns were illegal. So there is no legal way of being able to walk around with them, and even shotguns are heavily regulated, and you have to go and have a permit from the police, and you have to have them in a locked cabinet in your home. So the idea of being able to go and buy firearms and have them freely supplied to you using the dark web is driving a horse and cart through the real world laws that should be there. So it's good to see that at least in this occasion, the German police have been successful in taking down this this dark web marketplace, and let's hope that they continue with their efforts to take down more of them, because otherwise it is making it easier for criminals to get hold of anything from weapons like this to also, I mean, don't forget it's on the dark web where you're able to go and buy ransomware programs and buy other bits of technology that are free, very easy to use, that allow fraudsters and criminals to send out phishing emails, carry out malware attacks, ransomware attacks, DDoS attacks, without any real skill. You're just going and buying the product off the shelf on a marketplace like this. So the more that they are taken down, it's a slight victory on the ongoing war against the avalanche of cyber attacks that we end up discussing on here each week.
Thanks, Peter. That leads us very nicely onto our last story from Action Fraud. More than 50 million was lost last year to scams where victims are tricked into handing over control of their computer or smartphone to criminals. So this new data from Action Fraud, the National Reporting Centre for Fraud and Cybercrime, reveals that 20,144 people fell victim to scams where they were persuaded to grant criminals remote access to their devices. And it's quite funny, Peter sent me this story only this morning, and I found that myself received a scam email to my personal email account from seeming to be Currys, and they were saying, oh, you've won an Apple Mac and this brilliant bundle, and then they went on to say, oh, click here to receive this, fill in your details and we'll be able to send it out to you. And quite clearly, I don't remember the last time I went into a Currys store personally, so I knew for a fact that this was indeed a scam. But say if my grandfather had received this, I know that he regularly shops at Currys, and he is more likely to go for a scam thinking, oh crikey, yes, this is great. And so it's quite easy to see how the amount of people that have fallen victim to these scams is kind of represented here. It's just the sheer amount of money that has been lost, which is extraordinary. Victims have reported losing a total of almost 58 million, which is an average loss of £2,868 per person, which is an awful lot of money. I'll pass over to Peter.
It is, and in a country where we've currently got the cost of living crisis going on, you know, £3,000 is not an easy sum of money to replace. And that's the average sum that was lost here by these 20,000 different people who fell victim to these sorts of scams. Action Fraud sends out these sort of weekly updates telling people about data like this, and then recommending the usual stuff about, you know, making sure you're using multi-factor ID, contact your bank on trusted channels if you think you've fallen victim to a scammer. You know, follow guidance from the NCSC if you think your device has been infected. Only install software or grant remote access to trusted systems. All these things, it seems straightforward, but as you've just said there, Amelia, with that example of the Currys scam, where they're impersonating a well-known retailer, you know, all it takes is for a convincing looking email with a few decals on there and what looks like convincing language about, oh, you've won something, and in the excitement you're clicking on it and entering your details before you stop to think, is this genuine or not? Suffice to say, it kind of also go the other way. I mean, I'm probably now so careful about stuff that I receive that now very often, you know, genuine communications where people are saying they're trying to send stuff to me, and I'm like, well, no, I can't trust this. You know, call back, make sure it is genuine before we actually open it. Sometimes can make things a bit longer as well, but sometimes it is worth just verifying stuff before you click on it. Otherwise, if in doubt, don't open it. You know, is it urgent? Does it need doing? No, well, don't open it.
It's funny.
It's a matter of finding a happy medium.
Because I think it actually happened. One of the vendors that we use as a firm, they emailed us quite out of the blue recently to say, well, their bank details have changed, and that we were to invoice them to a different, I think it was a different address, and there was a lot of company details that have been changed. And you looked at the email and said, crikey, this doesn't seem right. And we ended up calling the vendor, and actually it was not a scam. It was true. But that sort of approach does actually kind of, although Potentially, it is going over and above what you would think. The result of us potentially falling victim to a scam as a solicitor's firm, where we do have kind of a higher standard there. Yeah.
Indeed, and I think that supplier thought they were, why are you calling? Why are you checking this? And it was like, well, we just want to know for the avoidance of doubt. But that's just it. I'm afraid that when you are dealing with this stuff day in, day out, you don't trust anything anymore. So that's why we sort of double check and triple check this stuff.
And like you say, and one of the main takeaways as well here is that Action Fraud do actually give you an email address to send suspicious emails to, and they will take a look at the email and actually, well, after I'd forward the curry scam to them, what they do is they take a look at the email, and if it's actually just a normal email, they'll get back to you and confirm, oh no, this is real, or if you don't hear anything, it's clearly a scam. But the point here is the fact that when you're reporting these scams, if you've got a few other people report them, it will flag, and they will be able to kind of do further research into this and try and get to the bottom of, oh, who's sending these emails? Can we block the website that they're trying to link you to? Which actually not only kind of stops you from clicking the scam, but it may also help other people in the long run, which I think is a really important message to take away from this, because it's not just protecting yourself, it's helping to protect other people against scams. So that was our last story of the day. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this webinar, and we will be back next week. Just a reminder that these episodes are available on our website, our YouTube channel, podcast channels as well, such as Spotify and Apple Music. And another thank you as well to Heather for joining us to talk through the stablecoin story first. And we will see you next week.